All right, in this video, we're going to talk about CSS Flexbox and the benefits that CSS Flexbox has to offer. There's a number of properties that come along with this module that allow us to better work with box elements within our page layout. And so here on this next slide, here are some of the things about CSS Flexbox. It's directional agnostic, and I'll just show you an example of that here in my CSS Builder. It's a site that you can go to. When you're working with CSS Flexbox, you need a container, right? And that's going to be the key factor when you're working with CSS Flexbox and working with CSS Grid. All of your box elements are going to be placed within a container, and that's going to be what allows you to control the various box elements. And so here we have a container called div class flex container, and we have 5 box elements within that container. All right. It's directional agnostic, right? This box here, in the sense that no matter how you place these boxes within the container, based on whatever value you give to the property, or the value you get to the property, you can change how they're placed within the container. So for instance, the row is going to give you the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But if you go down to row reverse, you can reverse those box elements. You can go down and do column, right? So from top to bottom, and then you can do column reverse. So like I said, this here in terms of how you place them is irrelevant. Because you can change the way they present it based on the CSS property, the values you place with the CSS properties. And there's a property called order in CSS Flexbox, so you can actually change the order. So you can have 3 show up in the 5 space and 5 show up in the 2 space. And so it's directional agnostic in the sense that it doesn't matter how you specify the HTML within a container, because you can always change and shift the boxes with CSS. One of the huge benefits is that with CSS Flexbox, it's going to do some automatic calculation of the height and the width for you on your behalf. And if you think back to traditional float, you had to actually measure out each box so that it would fit within the container. With CSS Flexbox, you don't have to do that. It'll automatically calculate the width and the height of the box based on available space. And so we'll do an example of this in just a second here so you can see how that plays out. Some people use CSS Flexbox to do page layout. I typically use Flexbox to work with box elements specifically and not to do entire page layout. But again, you can do an entire page layout with Flexbox. And so down below here is a good link to a site. It's a tutorial site on CSS Flexbox. It's going to give us a little bit more context, and I thought it was a well done tutorial. And so go ahead and right click, open that up in your tab. And so I already have it open in my browser. Let me just say a few words about this guide to Flexbox that CSS Tricks has put out. Like I said, it's a really well done tutorial, or a well done guide. Let me just say a few words about it here. All right, so the first thing you will want to when you first come to this page, if you can imagine, just take your mouse and just split the entire web page in half, right? So from top to bottom, right, you're going to split it in half. So the properties that on the left hand side here where my mouse is hovering are properties that pertain to the container, right? So you're going to target the container in your CSS, and only these properties will pertain to the container. The first property that you will want to use on a container is something called display flex. And what that does is it ignites flex into your layout, or it turns those box items that are nested within the container into flex items. So display is a very important CSS property. I would say it's probably one of the most important properties. But when you say display flex, basically you're turning the child items of the container into what we call flex items. You can change the direction, and that's kind of what we saw here with this example of how those boxes will show up. And so there's row reverse, column. You can basically dictate how they would wrap. So it would go from left to right and come back to the left and go to right. You can do a wrap reverse. And then you can do a flex flow. You can justify the boxes. And also the cool thing about this tutorial is that it gives you a visual of what will happen once you use that property. And then the properties to the right here that would pertain to the children, and the children that are nested within the container. And so here's an order property. You can change the order of how those boxes were to be displayed. There's flex grow, flex shrink, and then flex basis. And I'll say more about that in just a second here. The best way to kind of understand Flexbox is to do it. And so let's actually do an example, and you'll see how those properties will play out, or how it affect the various box elements in our site. All right, so here's our in-class activity that we will go over again during our time together. But what I want you to do is copy this code, and let's go ahead and create a project folder and begin to accomplish the 4 bullet points here. Like I said, this is a small activity that's going to get us acclimated to CSS Flexbox. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to minimize my browser. I'm going to go to my desktop here, right click, and create a new folder. I'm going to open that folder. I'll just call this CSS_Flexbox. I'll open that folder in my editor. So I'll just go to File, Open Folder, and go to my desktop here. And there's that folder. And I'll open that folder here, and then I'll click on a new file. I'll just call this flexbox_ex.html, and I'll paste in my code here. All right. And the first bullet point, and what I'm going to do is side by side so we can actually see the bullet points, the steps that it's asking us to take. All right. Okay, so the first bullet point here is add a container to the web page that has a width of 80% and center everything that displays in the browser. Again, remember, the first thing you want to do here is when you're implementing Flexbox, is you have to have a container. And so that first bullet point is telling us to put a container, because what we're going to do is we're going to make these 3 items here what we consider as flex items. So here I'm going to put a comment here and say implementing Flexbox, and I need a container. So I'll say div ID equals, I'll just call this flex container. And to make the 3 aside elements child items, I'm going to put the closing div tag here, and good coding practices, I'll tab that over. And then here we're going to add some CSS, and I'm going to add this internally. So I have to use my opening and closing style tag within the head, right? Because it's going to give information about the presentation of this document. And in here, I'm going to give it a width of my style rule to target this element on line 13 by its ID attribute would be pound flex_container. Open and closing bracket. That's the CSS syntax of a style rule. And then I'm going to give it width 80%. And it also wants me to display to center everything and display it in the browser. So I'm going to give it a margin auto. It's what's going to center everything that displays in the browser, and I'll save that. Our next bullet point here is apply a 3-pixel solid orange-red border to the container, and a 3-pixel solid green border to the immediate children of the container. So it's going to apply a border, and I'm going to apply the border so we can actually see the box elements take shape. So we'll say border 3 pixels solid orange red, and it wants us to apply a 3 pixel solid green border to the children. And so here I'm going to create a style rule, and I'm going to keep my tags clean. So what I'm going to do is say class, and I just call this actual flex item, and I'll add that to each of my box elements. I would say go ahead and follow along. This is going to be extra credit, and so if you submit the 1 HTML file of everything I'm doing within this video to a discussion, and I'll post a discussion inside of Canvas, you'll be able to earn extra credit for this video here. So here's my class, and I'm going to actually create a style rule for that. And so my selector would be .flex_item. And then here, it wants me to give it a border of 3 pixels solid green. And that's going to apply to all of the immediate children of this flex container. The next one here is create flex items of all the immediate children of the container. And let me pause here. This is key, right? So the question is, how do I turn each of these 3 box elements into flex items? And remember, the first thing you want to do when you're implementing Flexbox is to, and I'll make this bigger again, is to use a property called display flex. And you want to put that display flex on the container. That's what's going to basically turn these 3 items into what we consider flex items. And I'll just put a comment here to say flex items. So here, to meet the first demand of that bullet point, we will say display, and we'll just say flex. All right. Now let me save this, and actually let me get rid of this, and I'm going to show you what happens here when we do the display flex. So let's go ahead and render this in the browser. So we'll right click, open, I'm going to open this in Chrome. All right, so here's my box elements. I don't have any, basically you have a border around each of the container, which is this orange border, and you have the 3 box elements within the container. But if I were to right click this, watch what happens when I do display flex. So I have the container, but then here I'm going to add a new declaration and say display flex. And so at this point here, 1, 2, and 3 are now considered flex items. And then I would use the various properties on the right hand side to get those box elements to adjust and to align. But let's continue to flush out the details of this tutorial, and then I'll say more about how to work with the various child flex items. So each aside box element should have a flex grow of 1, a flex shrink of 0, and a flex basis of auto, and a height of 325 pixels. So that's going to put that in here, and this may not make a lot of sense right now, but I'll share more about what those properties mean here. So there's a shorthand property called flex. The first value is going to be the flex grow, and I'm going to put 1. The flex shrink is the second value, or the second position for the flex shorthand property. I'll put 0, and then the flex basis is going to be 325 pixel. Now there are some more specific properties, such as you can use flex grow, right? 1, flex shrink 0, and then flex basis 325 pixels. But instead of writing all 3 of these properties here, I'm just going to write flex 1, 0, 325, and that's the benefit of using a shorthand property. But just know that you could use this more specific properties to give some structure to those flex items. And so that's the third bullet point here, and then we're going to apply 10 pixels of margin around each flex item. So here's each of the flex items, and so we'll say margin 10 pixels. And then it wants us to justify the content of the box, each box, to space evenly. And so what that means here is down below, we're going to target the container, and there's this property called justify content, and then we'll just say space evenly. So here we go back to our code. This will go back up to our container. We'll paste it, and then we'll say space evenly. And we'll save it. And that essentially completes this activity. But now let me just say a few words about what I just did here. I'll save it, and I'll open in my browser, or I'll just refresh. And I forgot to put my display here, display flex. And now I'll save it, and I'll refresh. And I forgot to put a height on here, I believe. So I think each of these boxes here require a height of 325 pixels. So this was actually auto, my mistake, and then the height was 325 pixels. Great. All right, so save that, and then go back to my web page, and this is what you should have, right? But now let's talk about this. Let's digest what just happened here, and then we'll end this video. So I'll expand my browser here, and I'll just use the Google Chrome dev tools here to kind of explain what's going on. Again, the first thing you will need here is to have a container, right? So this orange box is my container, and that's shown up here where my mouse is hovering, where this gray bar is at. And I gave it some properties. Like I said, the first thing you want to do is give it a property called display flex, and that's what turns each of these green boxes into flex items. We gave our container a width of 80%, and we did a margin auto. That's what gets our box to basically our site to center, and that's where you see the orange active white space to the left and to the right. And then the justify content is if these boxes were reach their limit, then they would space evenly. And what space evenly looks like here is where my mouse is hovering. It'll evenly space within the container. And the big thing here now I want to talk about is I'm going to click on one of these flex items, and each of these box elements have the same declarations. They have this green border, and then they have this flex, what we call this flex grow, flex shrink, and this flex basis. Now this part can be confusing. So here's my explanation of the flex shrink, flex grow, and the flex basis. Let me start off with the flex basis, which is this auto part here. Right? If I click on this arrow down, you'll see the more specific properties. So auto is saying it's auto width, right? Basically fill the appropriate space. And so if I were to change this here, let's say to 200, right, pixels, or let's say max, let's say 10, right? Well, anyway, if you were the flex basis here, it's basically saying that what is the minimum width that these boxes can go. And so if you put auto, it's going to auto fill the space. But if you were to shrink these boxes here, let's say to 200 pixels, and I would condense the browser, these boxes would only go as small as 200 pixels. Right, so watch what happens if I were to try to go below 200 pixels. Right, it can't go no longer. Right, so once it hits 200 pixels, you see that the container begins to overflow the container, and they're not going to go below 200 pixels. So you can kind of think of the flex basis as the minimum width of the box elements. Right, now, what if I wanted these box elements to drop to the next line? There's a property that I can put on the container here that says flex wrap, and I'll say wrap. Now, if I do this here, right, so once my flex basis is hit, you'll see that these box elements will begin to wrap to the next line, and you'll see that that flex wrap is now on my container. But once the flex basis is hit, watch what happens. Right, they drop to the next line, right? So once 200 minimum width or flex basis is hit, it's saying, hey, you need to go to another line, and that's what the flex wrap does on the container. Okay, so that's flex basis. This first position here is the flex grow, and what that basically says is grow 1 times the proportion of all the other box elements within the container. So if I were to continue to stretch this box out, right, these boxes are going to auto fill, and then basically I'm saying grow 1 times the proportion of all the other box elements. And the same thing is true for the flex shrink in 1 time proportion of all the other box elements. And so what if I just only targeted this middle box and said flex grow, and I put 3? That means grow 3 times as fast as all the other box elements. And so I'll show you what that looks like here. So I'll add another class here, and I'll just say grow, right? And what I'm going to do now here is say dot grow, and I'm going to override it and say flex grow, and I'll put 3. And now you'll see that this box is a lot bigger than box 1 and box 3. And if I were to continue to, like, if I were to reduce this, but then if I were to continue to stretch this out, this box will go 3 times the proportion of all the other box elements within the container. And so like I said, flex grow, flex shrink may be hard to kind of understand at first, but this is the magic of Flexbox. There's a few other things that we can do here. We can change the order of these box elements. And so because I have grow class within the second box element, I could put an order property here and say order, right? And I can say -1, and you'll see that now 2 is the first box, and that's the directional agnostic. And so, like I said, there's a lot of neat properties that we can use for the container that will give us some structure to the various child items. And then we can also target each child item and begin to give some further structure to the various box elements within our container. And again, the big key here is that Flexbox gives us a better way of working with the various box elements. Now, there's a cool game that I would say, if you go ahead and take a stab at this here. There's 24 levels, but then what you want to do is use the correct property to get the frog onto the leap pad. And there's 24 challenges that you will walk through to kind of get acclimated to Flexbox. And for every student who've done this gamification of Flexbox Froggy, it's definitely helped them in their understanding of CSS Flexbox. So let me do the first one here for you. All right. So we have a style rule here that's targeting the pond. So this element here has an ID attribute of pond, but here, if we go ahead and say justify content, and we say flex in, right? That's what's going to get that frog to be on the leap pad. So what I'm going to do here, I'll make this 2 points of extra credit. 1 point of extra credit if you complete. All you have to do is basically watch this video and submit the code for activity 1, which we just completed, which is this one here, right? So if you save this, and all you have to do is submit an HTML file, which is going to be this flexbox.ex.html file, and you'll get 1 point. The other point you can earn is by submitting the 24 steps or the 24 levels of Flexbox Froggy. And what I would like for you to do is send a picture, do a screenshot of level 24 and post that to Canvas. So let me go ahead and create the Canvas postings so you can know where to post that at here. So I'll go to dashboard, and in our class, I'll put it in the discussion tab. So I'm not gonna do that now, but when you look in our class course site, you'll see a discussion panel to post both your code for activity 1 and then also for Flexbox Froggy. So again, get some practice with Flexbox. Use this tutorial and play around with some of the different properties you can add to the container, and some of the properties you can add to the children, the flex items, and then also try to take a stab at completing all 24 levels of Flexbox Froggy, and that should give you a good idea of how to implement CSS Flexbox and use some of the different properties that come along with Flexbox. So in our next video, we're going to talk about CSS Grid, and CSS Grid is a true page layout methodology, and so we'll talk about how to use CSS Grid, and you'll find that I typically use both CSS Grid and CSS Flexbox to basically create a page layout, and you'll see me do that within my class example. So stay tuned. We'll dive into CSS Grid in our next video.